Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Um, I'm at the Kyiv School of Economics, which is supported, by the way, by Swedish taxpayers' money as well as by many other sources of revenues, but we're grateful extremely to the Swedish citizens for getting us through some difficult times over the last 12 years or so. I'm an honorary president at the honorary president at the Kyiv School of Economics. I'm also at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a graduate of the Kyiv School of Economics, and most importantly, and not very immediately relevant for the presentation, I'm on the Council of the National Bank of Ukraine, so I'm not speaking here as a member of the Council, and whatever I say doesn't represent any views of the Council, of the National Bank of Ukraine, of the government of Ukraine, or of any policy institution of Ukraine, and all examples, names, and references are purely hypothetical. And I used as an illustration for potential economic forces at play. All right, so let me start with the title, which is really institutional and political transformation in Ukraine. And by political, I don't mean political parties. I rather mean the structure of the relationship of the different players, which directly translates in the economic structure of the country. So that would be the focus. The title, in Ukraine, there is this two terms, Zrada and Peremoga, which means victory, and I don't know, Zrada means betrayal, and everything is framed in terms of whether, it's basically good or bad. Is it good? Anything, whatever happens, the question is whether it's good or bad news, and it's a very black and white perception of the public, and this has become an idiomatic term which refers to the fact that the world is much more complex and rich, and we don't quite understand it. So this is what my title is alluding to. By saying Zrada and Peremoga in Ukraine, I really mean that we don't understand what the heck is going on there very well, and this is what I would like to talk about. All right, so this is an outlook for, up to the end of this year, and Ukraine has undergone a fantastic crisis over 14 and 15. It's perhaps the most severe crisis in the history of Ukraine since 1990s, maybe even more severe than actually in the 90s, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And here on the slide we have, current account. We see it has been negative. In fact, it's been negative prior to the crisis. And the reserves of the central bank have been depleted, and whether there were this ousting of the president or not, we would probably have an economic crisis of enormous consequences, regardless of the political situation. Because under the previous president, the central bank governor was afraid to tell the president, to report to the president about the rate at which the reserves were being depleted by the disbalance in the current account. And they accumulated the 9% of GDP in 2013 of disbalance, and they absolutely didn't have any reserves. They had to devalue the currency, but the president was under pressure, and so he didn't want to do that, and he didn't want to listen to that, and so it's just an accumulated distortion. And so then industrial production, GDP followed the crisis, and of course there is then the security crisis in the east of Ukraine, and Crimea situation, and the restructuring of the economy overall. But we have achieved in Ukraine macroeconomic stabilization. It's fragile, but the economy started to grow. But so there is some growth this year, and there is a prospect or expectation of the growth for the next year of 2.53%, which sounds very good, but really sounds, in fact, it's not so good, because if you look at Ukraine here, this is our projection to 17, maybe 2%, maybe 3%, maybe 3% later. And if you compare it to the, to the countries in the area, the projections for Ukrainian economy are smaller than for the neighboring countries. And the countries in the region have not experienced that degree of the crisis, obviously. So we have low base in Ukraine, and we don't have strong recovery. We have a recovery which is even lower than would be the recovery or just normal growth in the region. So there's something, it's a bit of a puzzle, because in principle you should be bouncing back much stronger, and you're not even catching up with the region. So that's a little bit of a problem. And if you look broader at the history of Ukraine, there's our fantastic performance here. Okay, Moldova. Moldova is the only country which is doing worse than us. So this is GDP per capita in the prices of 2011. This is where Ukraine started, together with Poland. Okay, slightly below Turkey, and slightly above Russia. And this is where we ended up. And this is really a puzzling country, because the neighboring countries, they all have different political and economic regime and circumstances, and they all are doing better, with the exception of Moldova. So, why is that? It's not obvious at all. In fact, I don't have an answer to that question. Why is that? I do not. And I don't think anyone has a reasonable answer. People will say things like that. There are distortions, there's political infight, and this and that and that. This is all descriptive, this is very good. But this does answer the question why we can't overcome in this specific country, with all international support from all countries over the last 25 years, under different political regimes, under different political allegiance and geopolitical situation, and so on and so forth, why Ukraine has not been able to actually start performing, or at least catching up to the neighbors. All right. And so what we see here is that Ukraine, it's not obvious, but if you look in the data in more detail, and it's of course not enough data, and it's more of an observation rather than a real conclusion, is that when there is a crisis, when the economies in the region sort of contract, Ukraine contracts more than the countries, and then it doesn't recover very well. So that picture which I just described for 2014 and onward, where we have a crisis and we're not recovering even on par with the region, is typical for the crisis as well. So Ukraine has a tendency of growing together with the markets, but growing slower, and then contracting more during the crises. Okay, so of course that's again just a description, but why is that Ukrainian economy cannot recover well and even catch up at least at the same rate so that it recovers? So it has weaker recovery, it tends to recover less, and it's more prone to crisis. So anyway, so Ukraine is a puzzle in that sense, and well, that's one observation I would like to start with or make as the background. But why is that? So, okay, we have the global economy ranking, and, it's doing fantastically. In the global economy ranking in 1996, it was between Saudi Arabia and Morocco, 108, so it's stable in that sense. 2006, it's one of 4 in global economy ranking between Gambia and Panama, and in 2014, it's 180. Okay, so we're in crisis. Those were not necessarily crisis, but we're in crisis now, and we're between Mali and Nigeria. Okay, and we have experienced at least 2 revolutions, depending on how you say, but that's massive street protests which led to the change of the regime. But there are a lot of other little smaller protests over the history of Ukraine in the last 25 years, and they're not as known, but if you count them, there are probably 8 to 9 of them, which put pressure on the government but have not managed to topple them, but maybe endogenously changed the direction a little bit, or sort of force the government to take some reasonable actions. So Ukraine has a history of political instability, and it has had 6 presidential elections. and 2 of them were early, which is actually legally very difficult to do in Ukraine. So you can dismiss the parliament, the president can dismiss the parliament, but and early elections can be called for the parliament, but you can't really call early elections for the president unless you have a revolution or something like that. So perhaps if there were a mechanism for early, if we accept political instability in Ukraine as given, maybe we should have a mechanism for early elections of the president, that we don't need to sort of destroy so much of the economy in the process of that. Who knows? Okay, just an observation. But anyway, we had 8 parliamentary elections, 2 of them were early, and we have had 17 cabinets in 25 years, okay? 17, so an average minister lasts, so you have a minister of finance whose time horizon is 1 year, okay? And you have a minister of economy whose time horizon is 1 year. So it's very difficult to start any serious planning, because these guys expect that in all likelihood they will be out of government by spring, by next spring they're out. Ukraine in the last, since 2013-14 events, Ukraine has had 3 governments. We have had 2 prime ministers and 3 ministers of economy, 3 ministers of finance. Well, we have the same central banker, so the governor is staying there, but that's a lot of IMF support and international institutions and agencies support, because they're saying, we can't, if you keep changing governors, we can't even, talk to you really about anything. So that's a problem. And perhaps the problem is that we have a very actually democratic political system. It's a plural political system. People have a voice. But there's no dominant ideology, and that's a problem. Maybe there is an ideology, we just don't understand it. And it's not really about, East versus West, although you can paint it like that a little bit. It's not about ethnic composition. It's not about left versus right. It's not about democracy versus non-democracy. It's not about any of that. It's just that there are different types of people. It's personality politics, but it's really democracy. Okay, so it's a poorly performing democracy. It's a puzzle. And why they can't consolidate and come up with the ideological positions and form ideological parties over this 25 years, even though the players are the same. There are Tymoshenko, there are some other people who have been there forever. Poroshenko has been there forever. Some of them get pushed out, but many of them are there, and they have been there for a long time. So they have their brand names, but we still don't have parties associated with them, even though the groups of people are there. We have groups of people associated with personalities, but we do not have parties really. They keep changing parties every election cycle, but these are the same people. So basically the same people come up with new brands. It's like having a company which keeps bankrupting, and then they come out, they rebrand it, but that's the same type of management running so it's a bad equilibrium, and we don't quite understand why that's the case. But really, if we think about the way the economic model worked in Ukraine, Ukraine has been able to use only 2 tools of government intervention. One is to give money to people who deserve it, whatever deserve might mean. They might be strategic people. Sometimes this is money, really, this is subsidies. Really, this is subsidies. And the second one is preferential taxation, not to take taxes from those who we can potentially tax, because the tax base is eroded. There's a lot of shadow economy. The state is weak in a sense, but they sometimes still can collect taxes and they forgive. So basically there are 2 tools. Nothing else works. Things like quota or licensing, because of corruption, these are very, very weak instruments. So, for instance, we imposed a ban on export of timber or something like that, right? And the rationale for that is to protect erosion of the forests in the western Carpathian Mountains, and that's a real problem, real ecological problem. We have villages being sort of moved by I don't know what they're called in English, even in Russian, I don't know, like Seli, yeah, I don't know how to say that, but basically you have mudslides, but massive mudslides in western Ukraine, in the mountains, and this is a problem. So they can't really enforce not cutting the sort of timber at the local area because the institutions are weak. So they impose a ban on it, on the export. Also hoping in the process that there would be some kind of local industry, we'll start building furniture. But in the end of the day, it's just corruption. And the customs still export allows the timber to sort of get out of the country, but they put it like the paperwork that is something else. Okay, that's furniture. Instead of furniture, it's timber. So that's it. You just have if you strip it down naked, the economic policy of Ukraine over the last 25 years, this is subsidies and preferential treatment on taxation, and of course then it's winner take all kind of tournament where whoever controls the parliament, the budget committee, the presidential veto power. And you turn it endogenously into the rent-seeking society. So once you are stuck in the weak institutional environment where the state cannot endorse or enforce other tools, then endogenously you create incentives for businesses to capture the state. So I think this state capture is the consequence in Ukraine of the weak state rather than the reason. I think businesses are very pragmatic nowadays in Ukraine, and they're extremely competitive and corporations, but they are playing in the field in which at least they need to protect themselves against their competitors not getting preferential tax treatment. So even if they themselves cannot pay bribes because they're international corporations, let's say some telecom companies, they have compliance departments, so they don't pay bribes. But they invest a lot in GR to prevent their competitors from paying bribes, and so this is a waste. It's a massive waste. Okay, so the bottom line is that I want to give you this video, okay?
Almost 3 years after the Revolution of Dignity, where does Ukraine stand? International and local media present a mixed and at times messy picture. Yet an in-depth review provides more clarity. Ukraine has made significant progress in several areas. In the energy sector, the Ukrainian government finally delivered on its promise to increase household gas prices to import parity, hiking them 11-fold. Historically, Naftogaz has been a heavy financial burden for the state. This year, the company is set to become a net contributor to the state budget. In the banking sector, the National Bank of Ukraine has removed non-viable and zombie banks and implemented ownership transparency policies. The central bank itself has undergone a tremendous internal transformation.
Every time I go to the central bank, I see changes, and that is such a big difference and a relief, I have to say.
Ukraine has overhauled its anti-corruption legislation to an even greater extent than in banking, energy, or any other area. Ukraine has created an independent anti-corruption bureau, which has already opened about 200 investigations against top officials, heads of state enterprises, law enforcement officers, and civil servants. Prozoro, the newly created public procurement e-system, has been recognized by a number of prestigious international institutions. However, these measures have thus fallen short of effectively combating corruption, which is considered to be the biggest obstacle to foreign investment. The overall reform progress, too, pales in comparison to the agenda. What are the stumbling blocks? Vested interests have captured the state and the economy, as evidenced by non-independent judiciary, weak antitrust policies, and favoritism in government decisions. Ukraine ranks one of the lowest in its region in terms of government effectiveness, and little has been done to change this. Whatever the reason is, Ukraine has yet to reach a tipping point. Reactionary forces are regrouping and pushing back. It is critical to protect the achievements, defend the reformers, and carry on.
So the point I was trying to make with this video, it was prepared for something else a little bit for a more general audience, is that the degree of problems in Ukraine is amazing. So the central bank has shut down half of the banking system because it was zombie banks, shell banks, related party lending. And currently in Ukraine we have over 50% of non-performing loans in the remaining credit portfolio, okay? We have 50% from those banks which have survived, we have NPL of the degree of 50%, okay? In order to bring the Naftogaz is the state monopoly of delivering gas. In order to bring, so basically Naftogaz has been bankrupt in the country for over the last, decades, because it was a hidden budget deficit, which you would have to monetize through the national bank. So the way it would work, that the Naftogaz, the state monopoly, would buy at a higher prices, import from Russia and elsewhere, and then would sell at an excellent business, would sell at a much lower prices to the public, and sometimes not to the public. At the pretense of public, it would go to actually industry, to oligarchs, so to sort of. And then you would have to cover that budget deficit within the state monopoly, and the state monopoly would issue bonds. And the bonds would be acquired by the national bank. And then this money, which national bank, of course, would monetize, would give it to the state monopoly. The state monopoly then would go to the market and would buy currency to pay for the gas. So the national bank then would simultaneously deplete its reserves and would provide an emission to cover the budget deficit of a state monopoly, while all of that would not be accounted for in the actual state budget, and it wouldn't be subject to any oversight. So that's sort of has been resolved. The banks. So just the degree of problems in Ukraine and how much has been done is impressive, but it's not even close to bring to sort of even, they haven't even started doing any serious, again, pension reform, educational reform, health reform. These are all issues which have not really been truly touched upon. It's more, the Ukraine has just achieved macroeconomic stabilization. By itself, it's a miracle. Shutting down half of the banks in the country, and they are presumably, those are the bad banks, and the bad banks are controlled by the vested interests. So that means that there is something, there's some progress with respect to the vested interest removal from the economy, but again, there's no specific, very strong political force behind that, so it's a little bit of a puzzle too. So it's a sub-puzzle. While we do not observe strong and clear political ideologies even now in Ukraine, we observe some removal of vested interests. Yeah, of course, under pressure of the foreign creditors and so on and so forth, but also under internal pressure as well. And so that's puzzling too. But anyway, we have a big bank, and some of you might or might not know that this bank has been nationalized on Monday. That's a big bank, so just to give you a degree of the bank, 56% of all retail cashless transactions, using cards in Ukraine are done through this bank. 56% of all transactions in the country. So if they shut down, which they threatened, and again, as I remarked in the beginning, this is all names are coincidental, and it's just a hypothetical environment. It has nothing to do with reality. So you could imagine that you have a very powerful group of people who control a very powerful banking asset, and that banking asset is bankrupt. So it has negative capital. It's missing 149 billion hryvnias, which is about $6 billion. Okay, $4 to $6 billion. The bank is missing $4 to $6 billion. It's on par. It's actually, it's top 10 fraud within the world ranking. So that's a problem. You need to recapitalize or capitalize this bank because it's a systemic bank. If you shut it down, you shut down the economy. It's 56% transaction, and most of the shadow economy is actually done at the small business level, medium and SME, small and medium level business, are done through this bank. Okay. So what do? In the old times, you do nothing. All right, because that's not the problem which appeared yesterday. It's been accumulating over the last 10, 15 years. So you do nothing. What you do, you continue to provide liquidity to the bank, hoping that your future successors, political successors, 5 to 10 years from now, will have to deal with that. Okay, you don't take this bank on because it's dangerous. In fact, it's dangerous. You can have a run on the banking system, you can have a run on financial system, you can destroy, and also people will not understand because the owners of the bank also control some of the media. So it's very complex. It is very complex. All right, but somehow this happened. I actually didn't believe it would, personally. I thought the Ukrainian government would not have the strength and guts to take this bank on and would just postpone the issue. But the good news here is that, and this is again what we don't understand, why this is happening. Why suddenly this started happening in Ukraine? It has not been happening for 20 years. Now something has started happening, and why this is happening, and why banking industry is being cleaned up, not other industries, not agriculture, for instance. Vested interests are amazing there. So the point is that the Ukrainian government tries to apply the same rules to all banks. And this is one of the remaining banks which has not met the capital requirements. And it has not been, despite being systemic, it has not been given an exception. But there is no responsibility. So no one from the owners of the bank or from the management of the bank will be held responsible in any way. In fact, from the 80 banks which have been shut down, I think there are absolutely no prosecution cases. Okay, I think only one owner or one manager, like board member, is under real investigation, and there are a couple which will die out, and basically no one is being investigated. And the Ukrainian public is quite upset because they think it's a deal between the government and the corrupt government and the corrupt bankers. And here I want to talk about political economy or game theory of this and macroeconomy of this. So first of all, because institutions are weak, you do not have legal enforcement. So you rely on relational contracting. You have individuals are important, unfortunately. So you have an owner of company, and that specific individual might be important because he has a lot of connections, and so he's playing some kind of repeated game, and in this repeated game, he's able to enforce the contracts. Now the banks and the real sector were connected in the very, like in many other countries in the region and elsewhere, but Ukraine is just delayed 10 years or so. You basically have a big financial and real sector corporation, and they create their own bank in order to self-finance. All right, they get deposits from the market, they attract them at high rates, and then they finance their own business. Now you have a shock to the economy, and the companies cannot perform. They just don't have liquidity. You have a contraction of 14%. So what do? Well, you can try to enforce performance of this company, so you can try to save the business. And I think the Ukrainian government endogenously has chosen to save the business, so it's a form of sort of easing or weak monetary policy on the company, because we do not enforce, apparently, any of these loans. We forgive, we shut down the banks, we bail out the depositors potentially, So we basically print, the losses, monetize the losses through the deposit insurance fund. But we do not go after the officials because they at the same time are the officials or the leaders of the real sector. And if we prosecute them, their business will collapse because it is a relational contracting. So you take those guys out, you take this big bank, and most 74% of their credit portfolio is commercial, and 97% of that commercial portfolio, according to the central bank figures, is related party lending, and this most of this is good business. I mean, the business which is not doing very well during the crisis, but that's actual, real, solid business. Agriculture, airlines, consulting, some real consulting, ports, terminals, some real infrastructure in Ukraine. And so you now remove, you might dislike that person in charge of all this big holding who defrauded depositors and clients of the bank. But if you really remove him from power, then his business will be subject to sort of disputes over the property rights because the property rights are insecure. And so immediately you'll have attacks on the property rights, and the businesses will be busy trying to protect themselves rather than producing something. You have a 5 or 7% of a real sector under attack, and Ukraine can't afford that. So strategically speaking, that's the best outcome. You have taxpayers pay for the shock, and you give forgiveness. It's not corruption in a sense. I mean, it is corruption, but it is not. All right, but okay, so anyway, so the historical, but that's some kind of new political contract. So I think from the political economy perspective, the institutions, either any regulator in Ukraine and elsewhere, including the central bank, is not independent. We can say all we want that they are independent, but they are not, and they have never been, and they are subject to political pressures. And what has changed in Ukraine, that there is a new political contract. And what is the change? What was the previous political contract? The previous political contract was very simple. Basically, we guarantee in Ukraine a minimal level of standard of living to most of the population. In response, we ask them not to basically ask questions, right? So we pay them pensions and minimal salaries. It's a welfare state. But we're not accountable as the state to them. All right? And so then there is a deal between the state and the business. And the deal is the following. In the times of crisis, when we need to pay everyone suddenly, we basically tax the taxpayers through the inflation tax, by devaluing the currency and so on and so forth, but we protect the businesses. And part of this is being seen. But now what is happening is that the contract is changing towards the contract that the businesses are not going to be bailed out. They are not going to be any more supported, but they're also not going to be harassed by the state. So that's why we have all this forgiveness. I don't quite understand why the contract has changed, but I can only attribute it to some kind of new political players in the country. All right, so here's the political ideology composition, in my opinion. I have been saying all the way that there is nothing in Ukraine. There's no political composition. Historically, we have had Democrats and socialists. I'm trying to say socialists, but they're not really socialists. They're sort of isolationists or protectionists. These are the guys with big businesses who have captured the state, and they stand to lose from modernization of the economy. So you could imagine a village in which there is 100,000 people or maybe 1,000 people, and they're all working in some kind of outdated industry where they manually, create something for a train, And if we modernize that village or that plant, you would have 2 engineers working there. And 98 of these people will be out of job. And so you will lose 98% of the political support. So local political leaders will not allow that. Unless you have a real educational reform, and I mean not at the sort of secondary school level, but at the level of adults, you need to modernize the human capital too. You can't just modernize the economy by the capital and have labor mobility. So there's a political sort of friction that these people, it's like miners, they stand to lose and they will resist. Unless you are serious about training them and giving them jobs, you are not going to have any political ability to move, to do any reforms. So you have those groups of people, and there are pockets all over the country, and they are very strong. Then you have the Democrats. So these guys just want to have sort of markets and all-inclusive stuff. And they have always been fighting there, with socialists being stronger. But because of the security crisis, you now have these patriots. That's not a specific group of people yet, but this is the ideology. That's the notion that we need to protect Ukraine from everyone, from Russia to the United States, to China, to Australia, to name it. And these guys are not necessarily Democrats. It's not obvious who they are, but their values are not, the idea is just isolationist in a sense too. And so this is the new player. And some of the big businesses are now sitting with these patriots. So the future of Ukraine depends, so this is the pivot player as an ideology. Again, I'm not saying that there are no specific people yet. I'm not talking about far right. Far right is really, really weak in Ukraine. Far right leaders went for elections and they got two of them together, less than 4% in presidential elections. So this is the idea. This is the idea that Ukraine is under threat and we need to be strong and we need to protect, and some measures are justified. And that idea is growing, and the question is whether this idea is going to be sort of who they're gonna form the coalition with Democrats or with socialists. And I think Democrats are in power currently, and some of these big bank and others are playing with the idea of patriots, because, for instance, the owner of the bank, or one of the big shareholders of the bank, he's in the East, he supported all kinds of defenses, invested a lot, so people associating with that. And so today I see this notion of nationalization of the bank and indemnity at the same time as an attempt to create a commitment device between these two groups in the country to form a coalition for the next 5 to 10 years. So in that sense, the institutions are not there, reputation is not there, so you cannot form the coalition. Their problems, they're betraying each other all the time. So they're trying to play on this, so the government essentially commit to be sort of corrupt by forgiving these guys. So they expose themselves to the claims during the elections that they have forgiven these guys. And on the other hand, they have information, and they can prosecute the owners of the bank. Of the banks, not only this bank. So there's some kind of coalition formation is happening through cleaning up of the financial system. I think this is fascinating in a way. All right, but there's a key confounding force, transparency. So people understand that and people don't like that, okay? And so that means that opens the door for instability again. And it's not clear how this transparency will play out. So the EU and the US are pushing a lot for transparency. I'm not convinced it's such a great idea, by the way. Some transparency is good, but maybe not full transparency. Currently, we have all the budget data available, so all the payments, so everything is quite transparent. We have e-declaration. Thank you very much. So
we have about 15 minutes for questions.
All right, no questions. Yes, please.
Can you elaborate on the last idea that you just cut in half?
This one?
Yes, right, exactly.
So I think transparency in Ukraine adding instability, because so what the state is trying to do, or no one is trying to do anything, it's just happening. I think there are these three ideas. If I'm going to be a bit more direct, one idea is that we need to protect our domestic producers, and that means rents and subsidies, but basically that's the old idea. This is a confused ideology which has, it's schizophrenic, that's why it didn't work in Ukraine at all. The idea is that we're gonna give money to the right industries, and then things somehow will work out. The problem with that is it is a mixture of common sort of, directed economy kind of approach and market economy. Because it's somehow will work out is the market economy approach. We give money to these guys. It's a direct. So if you're going to support industries, then you need to also set up all the infrastructure support, all the educational labor force, and so on. You cannot just give money to some guys and do not. If you are actually undermining the markets, then you have to provide the alternative. Because otherwise the money is going to be just sitting there, and of course if it's sitting there, it will be diverted. And I think that there are a lot of people in sort of outdated areas or industries which politically now are stuck in this situation, okay? So now I think the state, the sort of Democrats understand that that's the most promising, again, because of transparency. Democrats are going to grow in value because you have to include people. At least in Ukraine, you cannot, everyone is included in the decision-making process now. Today, the president, the parliament, you can basically use a Facebook campaign to undermine a political process. I can tell you two examples, for instance, which have been done, and this is off record, because I'm not going to identify anyone. But let's say the mayor's office in Kyiv passes something which is sort of vested interest, bad thing. What happens in the morning is some activists know about that, and they are very savvy. So they figure out the real Google account of the mayor, so they have that, and they target ads about discontent and protests against that decision. So the mayor wakes up, it's a real case, wakes up in the morning, goes on all the news sites, and everywhere he sees banners about the news. He's the only one, and there are 50 more people because people paid $3 for that. All right? So he calls an emergency meeting of the mayor's office, and they call it back. So you can do things like that. You can do aggressive mobilization. And there was a recent, Natalia might know, they remember they imposed this 22 euros barrier or something. Some law which would, in customs, create distortions. Basically, there was a Facebook page with 400,000 people commenting on that immediately. And that has been, of course, done by people who know how to use media, social media in particular, to consolidate support. And that forced either the president or the prime minister to withdraw support from the law, so the law was rescinded. And that happens daily. So there is a battle. Now, so transparency is going to be supporting this idea of the Democrats coming to power. But sort of the all-inclusivity idea, you can get rid of these people. But it also creates instability because the actions are fast and not well thought out. And you're pushing out the expert community, which is in between, because you have to act very, very fast. And so that becomes very stochastic and, sort of random. People can switch. You don't control the process, right? So it's sort of what you're doing is you're saying, well, we are subject to this today's social media pressure. Okay, that's by creating transparency, we bring these people, we bring in the voice of 2 million people my post typically on Facebook is viewed by between 10,000 and 20,000 people, a typical post, and I post 5 to sometimes 7 posts a day. So we bring these people, but we don't control the narrative. So transparency gives us information that we can give to people, but these people are not experts, so that creates instability. No one controls anything. So that's a danger. I think the transparency, too much transparency might be, there's some kind of optimal degree. So if we were to limit in Ukraine transparency and would focus on one issue rather than all of them, so right now all the data on a budget is available. Let's not make it all available. Let's make, sort of energy data available, for 1 year. And then everyone will be discussing the energy markets. The entire country will be. Otherwise, you have the pockets of discussions. 10,000 people are discussing energy, 10,000 people are discussing health, 10,000 people are discussing something else. So you have this clusterization, and you have absolutely no control, and that's pretty random. So I think transparency, too much transparency is a problem for Ukraine. And, yes, go ahead, and then I'll
My question concerns the creation of private bank.
Oh, yes.
And I know only from INET, so maybe they will see something stupid. I have read that, is it true or not that Kolomoisky simply has stolen money and left only toxic exit?
So Kolomoisky is officially one of the shareholders, but informally of Privatbank, but informally media considers him to be the owner of Privat Group, which is a big empire. But again, Privat Group itself is not a sort of strict hierarchical structure. What media reports is that if you have an idea, you can come to these guys and you become sort of, they finance you and there's some, you share. So it's a little bit of a big club, whereas they provide some functions of enforcement, financing, and so on and so forth, which might be not a bad solution in the, sort of Ukrainian environment. But again, this group has been deep. Well, anyway, I don't want to go into that too much because everyone has to get them security protection. Well, that's not funny because the governor of the central bank, receives direct threats from the fake accounts under his name, and anyway. So everyone, but so the fraud. I don't think that's the issue of fraud per se. I think there's some indigeneity in the fact that they have decided they have found it optimal not to recapitalize the bank and have the taxpayers. So in the end effect, it's some kind of deal between the state and a very powerful business group, that it's the taxpayers which will pay for the non-performing loan. There is a little bit of fraud, I'm sure, but this is real business. And they have decided to use the funds to channel that to the business. They're not shutting down the business. They're not selling the business and moving it out of the country. So the business is there operational. So in that sense, I think it's sort of quantitativism or some kind of. So they are giving liquidity to the business, but they already had that liquidity, so they just decided not to pay to the bank. But now you have the obligation, so someone has to pick them up, and the Ministry of Finance is essentially giving in, so sort of issuing bonds, right? And then the question is, do we really need to give liquidity? That's a very good question, because if there is no run on the bank, you actually don't need to have liquidity and right now. And there is an obligation on the shareholders to restructure the portfolio such that in the future, if the portfolio starts performing, they will pay back. So it might very well be, if in the best case scenario, that in fact the taxpayers will not pay much for it.
Okay. And how will it influence on currency?
Again, it depends on the panic. If there is a run, the central bank will have to monetize the bills or the bonds issued by the Ministry of Finance, and that would probably lead to pressure on the currency. But we have not seen much of that, because we have only seen a daily increase in withdrawals by 100%. So let's say the bank has 150 billion assets and they have a daily withdrawal, turnover rate of 1.5 billion or something. We have seen 2+. So it's not substantive. It's like instead of 1% turnover, you are seeing like 1.5, 1.7 withdrawal. That's not a run on the bank. The run on the bank would be, a call on 10% or 15% of the assets of the obligation. That's, 1% call. Instead of 1%, you're calling on 2. That's some nervousness. Some people have not read the news or something like that. The interesting thing is that the businesses panicked, not the public. The businesses stopped for a day transacting with the bank. So the retail chains sort of cut off. So that's an interest. I don't understand why the businesses panicked, but also maybe because the government showed signs of populism and issued additional insurance guarantees for the deposits, but not for the businesses. So maybe that's why the businesses panicked. But I think it's back to normal. The issue is really technological or technical. If the IT systems, will be merged and transferred, and the new management move in, so this kind of real standard merger and acquisition problems now. They are sort of friendly acquisition, but not fully friendly acquisition, okay? Because there's some insider information and so on and so forth. So that's a question of acquisition, and it might go well, might not. So far, it's been going well. third day the new management is in, as supposed the font of sort of liquidation team was for 2 days only. That's fantastic. No run, no, the exchange rate went up by, I don't know, what is it, 3% and went down. So I think so far it's stable, but there's, the risks are there. Yes, and yeah, you had, there was a question, yeah, please.
My main impressions from your presentation that the Ukrainian puzzle is unique. As for me, I don't think so. And how about Italy in 60s and 70s? The same situation. Brazil, the same. And Romania, corrupted, weak institutions, and so on. My question is the following. What do you think? Maybe it makes sense to make a comparative analysis, and on the base of this analysis to find, to better understand what's going on in Ukraine, because Ukrainian case is not unique. I am absolutely sure. And the same to find the best practice, how to resolve this problem,
So sort of, I agree. My comment to that was why is Belarus, Russia, and Poland are doing better? In that sense, I think it's a unique. So it's a regional problem. Of course, historically, absolutely. There's no single new force there. It's just the combination of forces. Security crisis, corrupt state, all of that. There's nothing in any of this. There's nothing new. I agree completely with that. It's been over and over. So this combination of forces. But the question is, sort of, the conditions 25 years ago were similar in sort of not quite, but. And you see every different countries taking different models of governance. Some of not fully consciously. It just happened maybe to an extent, but all of them are doing better. And so the question is, what really went wrong with Ukraine that we have arrived at this non-unique case, of course. So where was the tipping points where things could have gone differently? So that's, I think we don't, but you're correct, by studying properly the other cases, we can come to the conclusion. Yeah. Yes, please.
Roman Dobrinsky from the Vienna Institute of International Economic Analysis. Thank you very much for your fascinating story. It's really fascinating. And I really appreciate the analytical approach that you apply to the situation in Ukraine. We all know that Ukraine is in deep crisis, economic, institutional, political crisis. And you very well explained that it's an extreme case of state capture, failed state, basically. There are all attributes of the failed state. What I wanted to ask you is, do you see a way out of this situation? The gentleman who just spoke was right that there are many cases of failed state, of state capture. We have seen cases when this situation continues for decades, centuries. Is this the future of Ukraine? There are ways out of the situation of state capture. Sometimes the crisis becomes so deep that basically people go out to the streets, and in a revolution they enforce changes. There are in-between cases. For example, if you have very strong external anchors, they may help. There are other cases, if you have a great visionary leader who manages to attract the masses, to get a popular vote in support of his ideas, and thanks to this great popular support, he can institute change. What future do you see for Ukraine under these conditions?
But okay, so So I agree with each of the points individually, but with the picture overall, I was trying to give not black and white. That's why the title was Zrada and Peremoga. You in a sense focused more on the Zrada, failed state and such. I don't think a failed state is capable of taking on a bankrupt bank, which has serious political and even law enforcement support within the country. So in fact, I think what's happening, the right way to think about it is that the state, for whatever reasons, is cleansing itself and has done quite a bit, especially in the banking system. But I think we also know that often central banks lead the change with, sort of ensuring macroeconomic stability, forcing the banking system to become more accountable, and after that, hoping that this will translate into the real sector. And in fact, in Ukraine currently, there is another distortion or a puzzle. It's not quite a puzzle, but again, and you're right, there's nothing new about that. There is structural liquidity. Some banks who survived, so I talked about 80 banks being shut down, but there are 80 banks which survived, and then 40 banks remains to be seen. But those banks had pretty conservative or pretty healthy models, and now they are flushed with liquidity. So yeah, I can name you several banks, but they are accepting currently deposits in hard currency at 0%, 0.1%. That's the rate on the deposit. They don't need liquidity, they have it. Whereas some other banks are paying 5 to 10%, including this big bank, Privat Bank. Even now they're accepting money. So basically liquidity is there, but then they cannot, and then there are these big companies which are coming and saying, oh, we have $10 billion contracts with China, but we cannot get financing from the financial system. Why? Because they're not transparent. So now liquidity is in the system, but those banks which survived and have liquidity, they're basically very clean. They're not dealing with shadow economy, and they are demanding that from the business. So today, if you have a clean business, you get a financing. Today, you can get a loan that's real. Number at short money, not long money, but at 14% in local currency with 12% inflation and expected inflation for the next year 8%. So you're actually paying the real interest at 2-3% if you are clean. The problem is that real sector doesn't have a history of being clean, and I hope there is enough motivation with this liquidity and cheap money for the companies to start cleaning themselves up. That needs to be complemented. So the motivation is there. So the business needs money. If they are clean, they get money today. If they are not clean, they basically don't have any access to capital. So that's a strong incentive. So I wouldn't call immediately that all is lost in Ukraine. I would just say that Ukraine needs to do so much, as many other countries in the area as well, but in Ukraine specifically has to do a lot of homework. And in a sense, against all odds, it has been doing it at least in the banking industry and also in the gas industry, which we know historically have been two major issues. So understanding why it works helps us understand how we can scale it up to other areas of the economy. So I know a lot of people believe in leaders. I don't believe in leaders. I don't think that, the right president for Ukraine will do the job. I think it's really about structural problems which have been accumulating, and now you need to resolve them slowly, and hopefully we will be able to, the fight is there. The independence of the central bank or independence of other regulators is always under pressure, especially from those companies which have been removed from the access to cheap credit and state budget. So those guys are pushing back. They will continue to push back and so on and so forth. That will take some time. So it's all fragile. But I think it's moving in the right direction, and I hope that's a sufficient shock for Ukraine that finally it will be able to resolve, and like 10 years or 20 years from now will become a successful economy. Okay, early signs of that are there, but again, it's not given. Okay, it's very fragile, and anytime it can be reversed.
I'm sorry if I take the word just for a short follow-up. Still, I did not get a clear answer to what I was actually asking. If you don't have it, you can just say.
No, but I don't understand the question, perhaps, maybe if you can formulate it.
So, still, what kind of future you see for Ukraine? One of the problems, you mentioned it, that all political contracts have been kind of only implicit. You need a contract to have a clear political contract. You need a contract between the governing elite and the population. And you need accountability whether this contract is being honored. Even in the new political contract with the new Patriots and the Democrats, at least from what I heard from you, there is no such clear link between what the elites are doing and what the population would like. And I don't see the accountability of how this contract will be honored.
I don't quite understand the question, perhaps, but you're asking what kind of future Ukraine has, and my answer is that these structural reforms are on their way. They are fragile. I think the Democrats, by necessity, have to somehow offer something for the public, because public is wants to be part of, wants to be included. The answer is that one scenario is it will be great, the other scenario it will not be great. I don't know how to answer this question, what kind of future it is. I can tell you that the structural reforms are underway. That's all I can answer. And any political contract is always implicit. I mean, no one writes, the government never writes a contract with public and say this is our contract. I mean, it's just. No, you think what's written in constitution? I mean, in Ukrainian constitution it's written people shouldn't, have the right for this and have the right for that, and in every other constitution it's written. And in this area, in all of these countries close to us, not all of these rights are served to the same degree. So, there's a real contract there, and there is an official contract. So, anyway, okay. Any other questions? Oh yes, please. Sorry.
You were talking about the uncertainty introduced into the whole system if you have too much transparency, but then you're saying that the banks don't lend because they don't have transparency of the state businesses at least.
That's a different transparency, right? So public transparency, and transparency in specific, private transparency. Actually, touching on a larger fundamental issue. We have this big data now, big databases. Who has rights over the information? So clearly we need to collect this data. This data has to be of good quality. That's a national security issue for every country. But then who has rights over that? Today in Ukraine, the push is to have rights. The public has rights. So everyone has public access. That, I suggest, might lead to instability. And also, I have not been talking about it, but it also can lead to sort of bigger corporations having more power, which is potentially a problem in weak institutional environments. Whereas what we need for interaction in the banking system, that the companies themselves have very good data, which they can privately open to during the individual transactions to the banks. All right, so these are two different things. They have to be transparent not to everyone, but to a specific counterparty. So these things do not contradict each other.
As an insider, which do you think can or should become the sources of economic growth for Ukraine?
That's good. So I'm biased, absolutely biased. And I think the future is medium business. So I think mid-cap business has the largest stake in the country for cleaning up the institutions. Because the big-cap business, most of them, they are protected because they have political support or they have access. They are big enough that they can buy the sort of lobby effectively. The small sort of, entrepreneurs, they are surviving essentially, and they typically are weak. So this is not high tech. This is not, they are selling something. They are producing. It's almost subsistence economy. At least if we're talking about large numbers. But if we're talking about mid cap, a lot of mid caps tend to benefit tremendously from the economy improving. So there are tons of people who acquired all kinds of, currently junk assets, and a lot of companies which are sort of sufficiently large companies, but because the economy is doing so poorly, They are basically not large. So that is the constituency. I think medium-sized, mid-cap business is the constituency which can drive the economy forward, both on political and economic level, and including investment in human capital too, by the way. And we see signs of that. And even, I'm going to plug the Kyiv School of Economics now, but we see that mid-cap starts supporting the Kyiv School of Economics, which has not been happening before. And so these things, I think, and we also see a lot of investment in education by mid-cap. Small investments, but sort of outside of the system investments.
Not optimistic, though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.